I'm so excited for today's episode because for me, it is the unofficial kickoff to this year's NFL season. Today, I'm diving deep into NFL training camps and going behind the scenes on what happens during those long, hot summer weeks as fans and media try to speculate who will beat the odds this year and who will fall flat. Training camps are chaotic and long and exhausting and sweaty, all by design. After voluntary camps and mini camps and summer break, this is the real test. It's the real push, the point of no return for a player's next season, maybe even their legacy or even their career. Most of the players in attendance are there to grab a roster spot or solidify one. I read one journalist say training camps smell like constant desperation. But there are quieter and maybe odder moments as well. Like the one time in 2005 when, according to sports writer Gordy Jones, Terrell Owens repaired the basketball hoop in the parking lot outside the building housing the Eagles' locker room and spent 15 minutes shooting hoops with a ball that wasn't quite fully inflated. Or in 2019, when wide receiver Antonio Brown showed up to the Oakland Raiders training camp in a hot air balloon. That's a true story. All in all, training camp is this strange pressure cooker where people we so easily put on a pedestal line up with rookies looking for a shot at a dream they've had since they were a kid. For this episode, I'm going behind the scenes at what it's really like in camp, down to what they eat, where they live, the unwritten traditions they have to follow, and the emotional process that cuts each team down to 53 players. And a quick housekeeping note for this episode, I'm recording this on July 30th. So as of today, all 32 teams have started their training camps. I'm not going to talk much about what's already happened in the various camps so far. And of course, there may be breaking news between now and when this episode drops. If that happens, I'll cover it on the Middle's social channels. So if you don't follow us on Instagram or YouTube, go over and drop a subscribe. Now, let's get into what could easily be called the ultimate corporate offsite, complete with travel, performance reviews, and a lot of headcount reductions. Let's start with some numbers to set the stage. First, 4. That's how many phases of official training that players go through. See, training camp may look like the kickoff to the upcoming season, but it's actually the fourth of 4 phases that started months earlier. Here's how it breaks down. First is phase 1. All teams start this phase in April. The exact timing of it depends on whether a team has a new head coach, though. If they do, the team gets to start earlier. So for this season, clubs like Arizona, Atlanta, and Buffalo, they all opened their 2026 program in early April. The rest of the teams started roughly 2 weeks later. This first phase runs 2 weeks, and it's pretty bare bones. It's a lot of meetings, conditioning, and physical rehab, and that's about it. If and when drills are held, no footballs are even allowed on the field. The rare exception to that, though, is quarterbacks throwing to completely uncovered receivers or specialists who are working independently at that time. Phase 2 immediately follows phase 1 and runs for 3 weeks. And this is where coaches are finally allowed back onto the field with players, but everything still runs at a walkthrough pace. The players' collective bargaining agreement explicitly bars any live contact and prohibits the defense from even trying to impede a play the offense is running during this time. Immediately following phase 2 is phase 3. And this is the 4-week phase that some fans are familiar with that happens in about late May, maybe early June. It's only in this phase that teams get to have 10 allotted practice days of real team versus team drills. Although even then, it's strictly no pads and no live contact. This is the mandatory minicamp that a lot of fans hear about or might recall over the summer. So stacking all of this on actual 2026 calendars, just to give you a view, a new coach team ran phase 1 from roughly April 7th to April 20th. Then phase 2 from about April 21st through mid-May, before rolling into the 4-week phase 3 window that closed with the mandatory minicamp in early to mid-June. A same coach team did all the same things this year. That sequence just shifted about 2 weeks behind new coach teams. And there's one additional minicamp worth mentioning, too. New head coaches are allowed to hold a voluntary veteran minicamp that returning staffs aren't entitled to. The catch is they have to hold it before the NFL draft, but not before the third week of a team's offseason program, and only after at least 1 week of phase one activities have already taken place. Now, that's a lot of mathing. So if you remember anything, just remember that it means the window to do that mini camp is pretty small. The camp only lasts a few days, too. But it does allow new coaches to start putting extra face time with their veterans. Next, number 7. Rookies get their own separate 7-week runway each spring to help them quickly familiarize themselves with the team's playbook, building, and even culture. This window opens with a 3-day minicamp, which is held on either the first or second weekend following the draft. After that, rookies keep coming in on weekdays. They aren't allowed to do any team activities on the weekends. And they come in for classroom work, strength and conditioning, and playbook installation. Finally, 90. That's how many players a team is allowed to carry into actual training camp, which is phase 4. And if you're thinking, that's not the 53 number I hear tossed around during the regular season, you're right. Every team overloads its roster on purpose because training camp is, at its core, a several-week-long audition with a hard deadline at the end. And not everyone on a roster is fighting for the same thing. A rookie on a minimum contract this year is playing for a base salary of $885,000. A veteran with a couple of years in the league has a minimum that starts around a little over $1 million, but can climb past $1.3 million depending on tenure. So, yes, technically, a 10th-year veteran and an undrafted rookie are fighting for the same 53 spots. But one of them is probably playing for security and maybe a future Hall of Fame nomination, maybe even an MVP award, and the other is playing for his first real paycheck. Now, in training camp, teams are capped at 16 padded practices for the entire camp. Before a single pad goes on, every player has to go through a mandatory 5-day acclimation period, easing into the heat with no contact at all. Once padded practices start, teams can't run more than 3 consecutive days of practice in 3 of the 5 weeks of camp, and they can run no more than 2 consecutive days in the other weeks. 1 mandatory day off is required every 7 days, and 2 full days off are required in the very first week alone. No single practice, padded or not, is allowed to run longer than 2.5 hours, and players can't be required to be at the facility for more than 12 hours in one day. So those are the numbers and what's on the line as each player goes through each phase. But once they hit phase 4, the training camps we all get excited for, the ones that have the most hype, what do their days actually look like? Let's look at it. Training camp is both very similar and very different for the 90 guys living it. Wake up is early, typically around 6 a.m. From there, it's breakfast, then treatment, meaning taping, stretching, massage work, whatever a guy's body specifically needs that morning before he puts pads on. Then it's meetings, a team meeting to start, usually brief, led by the head coach, followed by a special teams meeting that keeps everyone in their seats except the quarterbacks, who will then peel off to their own room. After that, the group splits fully. Offense goes one way, defense goes the other, and they'll do position-specific installation that can run another hour or more. Around mid-morning, a lot of teams build in a high-calorie recovery shake. One well-documented version blends 2 scoops of protein powder with chocolate milk, peanut butter, sounds good so far, but wait, a quarter of an avocado, and olive oil. And I've been told it is not a smoothie for taste. It's a calorie and healthy fat delivery system disguised as a smoothie, built to get dense nutrition into a player's system fast between meetings without asking him to sit down for a full meal. Mid-morning is also the first practice of the day, which is usually a walkthrough. Lower intensity, more about installing and rehearsing that day's plays than hitting anybody. That's a relatively modern development, too. Throughout the 90s and earlier, camps ran what were called two-a-days, and if you're familiar with football, you've probably heard that term. These would have been 2 full-contact, full padded practices, back-to-back in a single day, every single day. Players who lived through that era described it as genuinely brutal. The current collective bargaining agreement banned that format outright because of the injury risk and replaced that first session of practice with the lower impact walkthrough that they do now. Practices today also alternate between padded and helmet-only days under those same rules, rather than defaulting to full pads every time, the way they did a generation ago. After that, it's finally lunch. And lunch is not a cafeteria line where everyone grabs the same tray. Meals are individually calibrated by position and by each player's specific body composition targets. So because of this, lunch is served over a long window, typically about 11:30 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, specifically to accommodate players on a staggered practice and treatment schedule. And it makes sense. A 300-pound guard is not eating the same plate and nutrition as a cornerback who's trying to stay lean and fast. And teams can track that difference to the calorie. After lunch, there's usually a short rest window. I've been told a lot of guys try to take a nap during that. And then it's the day's real practice, which happens in full pads and is, by every account, the hardest and most physically demanding part of the day. It's also usually the hottest part of the day, which is not really bad scheduling so much as an unavoidable fact of holding practice in the middle of July and August. Hydration in that heat is its own science project, too. Players can lose more than 2 liters of sweat an hour in serious heat, but the human stomach can only absorb a little over 1 liter an hour, meaning a hard sweating player is physically incapable of replacing fluid as fast as he's losing it, no matter how much he drinks. So teams weigh players before and after practice to calculate individual sweat rates, factoring in exactly how much fluid was consumed, how much was lost, and then they use that data to customize precisely how much water and electrolyte replacement each specific player needs going forward. Dinner follows the afternoon practice, and it usually includes things like a lean protein, think 6 ounces of chicken breast, a starch like a sweet potato, some mixed vegetables, maybe even a green juice. Then there's more meetings in the evening where the day's practice film gets broken down position by position before a final protein shake before bed. And that shake mirrors that morning smoothie to support overnight muscle repair while the player's body sleeps. Lights out is typically 10 to 11 p.m., and then the entire cycle repeats the next morning. Of all the phases, this training camp is the most intense, there's no question. And the league treats attendance at camp very seriously. Unsigned rookies cannot attend camp at all unless they're under contract. In fact, unsigned rookies aren't just barred from practicing, they can't even be at the facility. This year, LA Rams rookie Ty Simpson signed his deal the same day the team reported for camp. That's how down to the wire it got. Veterans are a bit of a different story. Those with unresolved contracts still show up, but some try to use skipping camp as leverage to get more of what they want. That said, the league fines players $50,000 a day for every day they miss camp. And teams generally can't forgive those fines even when an agreement is reached. So a more common move for veterans is to show up to camp to avoid the fee, but not practice or participate until their situation is resolved. And it's harder for veterans to skip camp when camp is miles, maybe even states away from home base. Which leads me to this. Who's staying close to home this year? And who's taking an all-expense-paid trip down the road? So where are all 32 training camps happening? Well, training camps used to look a lot like baseball spring training. Teams left home entirely, set up camp in a small town for a month, and that town got to have their 15 minutes of fame hosting a major football program. Back in 2000, all but 5 of the league's teams traveled to their training camps. That model is almost extinct. By 2013, 19 teams were just using their own facilities to host camp. And this year, 2026, 26 teams are staying entirely local. Only 6 teams still leave home, and I'm putting home a little bit in quotes, for the entirety of camp. And some still don't go terribly far, hence the quotes. The Buffalo Bills go to St. John Fisher University in Rochester, New York. The Dallas Cowboys head to Oxnard, California. The Indianapolis Colts hold camp at Grand Park in Westfield, Indiana. The Kansas City Chiefs park up at Missouri Western State University in St. Joe, Missouri. The LA Rams head to Loyola Marymount, which is still in LA. And the Pittsburgh Steelers hold camp at St. Vincent College in Pennsylvania. The Steelers setup is the deepest rooted training camp tradition in the entire league, too. This year marks the 60th year St. Vincent College has hosted their camp. The shift away from that model of travel has largely been because of comfort, technology, and, frankly, money. Modern facilities have the meeting rooms, the recovery equipment, the cold plunge tanks, the video infrastructure. They have it all that a repurposed college dorm really can't match. Staying home also means more fans can pay to attend practice at a full NFL stadium than could ever fit into the bleachers at a smaller college field. But for some, there's a real argument that keeping camps at these multi-million-dollar facilities has eliminated the old leave town, live in a dorm, get bored together model that was built specifically on the theory that discomfort and isolation forge a team faster than comfort does. I don't know if there's any data around whether a modern training camp versus the older style results in a better team. Maybe we should ask our friend Cynthia Freeland if that's something she tracks. But I do know it's a bit entertaining to imagine grown adult men in their 30s having to bunk in hot, stuffy college dorm rooms with bunk beds and oscillating fans and desks from the 70s. But regardless of where the camps are held, they create a lot of buzz with fans. Almost every team offers free or nearly free admission to watch certain practices, and there are fan zones built around the practice field. Players stop to sign autographs at various points throughout, too. I will say, though, that the autographs are almost universally rationed to kids specifically. The Denver Broncos, for example, limit signings to fans aged 5 to 15, and the Ravens do something similar for ages 6 to 12. And most teams rotate which position groups sign on any given day, rather than opening up every player to every fan every day. The fan zone is an experience, too. The Buffalo Bills have a kids area with a football toss and running back drills. Other teams have face painting and t-shirt cannons and merch tents. There's all the merch tents. And there's a hierarchy to the fan experience, too, that is a bit more hidden. General public open practices get mixed in with separate days reserved only for season ticket holders. Some have theme days. The Detroit Lions, for example, run 5 general public practices, 4 exclusive to just season ticket members. They have a community partner day, and they have my absolute favorite, an annual pet adoption day. And if you don't believe me, go follow the Lions on social media. It's adorable. And speaking of traditions, let's look at 2 traditions that every team embraces during camp. Have you noticed them? Let's start with a camp visual that a lot of fans half notice but probably really don't think about. The quarterback in the different colored jersey. At almost every level of football, teams dress their quarterback in a jersey that stands out from everyone else on the field. It's usually red, although teams whose main colors already include red will sometimes switch their quarterback to yellow or green or really any other contrasting shade. The purpose, though, is universally understood inside the locker room. This player cannot be hit under any circumstance in practice. And this isn't a soft suggestion. It's treated by most as a sacred team rule. One longtime NFL safety recalled his rookie camp with Green Bay when the message about hitting a Pro Bowl quarterback was made explicit and very, very simple. Touch him, and you will be handed an apple and a roadmap, meaning you'd be released on the spot, effective immediately. And when the rule gets broken, even briefly and by accident, it becomes news. During a Titans training camp practice last year, Cam Ward threw a touchdown to Calvin Ridley in a red zone drill, then shoved defensive tackle Jeffrey Simmons in the back before doing his signature Zombieland celebration in front of him. Simmons, in turn, shoved Ward back with both hands to the face mask. The offensive line rushed in, and the two had to be separated. Simmons even admitted afterward that he was in the wrong for touching Ward, and things resolved, but it became a news story because it was the breaking of that unwritten rule. But not every team follows the convention, interestingly. Dallas has, at various points in its history, broken from the red jersey tradition entirely for years, under different head coaches, for reasons nobody in the organization has ever fully explained on the record. So a small reminder that even a rule this universal isn't actually written down anywhere. A more controversial tradition is hazing. Rookie hazing in the NFL has softened a lot over the decades, but a few rituals have survived almost untouched. The most universal one is this. At the end of practice, rookies collect and carry the pads and helmets belonging to every veteran in their position group, hauling all of it back to the locker room in one trip. Fail to bring a single piece back, and the tradition holds that you might find yourself taped to the goalpost the next day, sometimes with a bucket of ice-cold water waiting for you once you're stuck there. Rookies also traditionally cover breakfast for the entire position room. Think boxes of donuts or breakfast sandwiches, and they're expected to keep the snack table stocked in the team meeting room throughout camp. Veterans who've lived through it describe the whole system as a bit of a short-term tax that pays off for the rest of your career. You do it for exactly 1 year, and then you're on the receiving end of that same courtesy for every year that follows. There's also an unwritten rule that runs alongside the jokes. Rookies are taught early to genuinely respect the equipment staff, trainers, and other support personnel, since those relationships matter for the rest of a player's career far more than any prank does. The single best-known standoff in this entire tradition happened in Dallas. For years, veteran receiver Roy Williams had a rookie carrying his pads every single day. When receiver Des Bryant came in as a first-round rookie in 2010, he simply refused. He publicly said he was drafted to play football, not to carry someone else's equipment. It became actual national news, in part because Bryant was widely seen as the eventual on-field replacement for Williams, so it made the refusal come off as something more than ordinary rookie attitude. Bryant paid for it anyway, just in a different currency. One night, the offense went out for a team dinner at a high-end steakhouse in Dallas, and the bill, reportedly north of $54,000, went entirely on Bryant's tab. So it's become the go-to cautionary tale that gets told to every rookie class since. A way of saying, you can skip the tradition if you really want to, but the group always finds a way to collect. And not every hazing story carries that kind of edge. Some are just genuinely funny. Tight end Jeremy Shockey, as a rookie with the New York Giants, was pushed by a veteran to stand up in the middle of a team lunch and sing his college fight song on the spot. Shockey said he'd happily do it after he finished eating. The veteran pushed the issue anyway. A fight broke out in the mess hall, and Shockey stood up and sang the song once things settled down regardless. There's also a widely circulated but unattributed legend of a veteran spending an entire week convincing a rookie that the team chaplain was secretly an undercover scout working for a rival franchise. It led the rookie to quietly avoid the chaplain and all Bible study sessions all week out of pure, baseless paranoia. But no training camp tradition may be as heartwarming as one out of Green Bay, which would pain me to say if I didn't love it so much. Since 1958, kids from the community have lined up outside the stadium with their bicycles, hoping a Packers player picks their bike to ride the short distance across the street to the practice field, while the kid walks alongside carrying that player's helmet the whole way. Back in the era when the team trained away from Lambeau Field at St. Norbert College, the exact same ritual existed under a slightly different name. Each Packer would essentially adopt a local youngster for the length of camp and borrow that kid's bike every single day, with the kid tagging along to carry the helmet each time. Today, the practice is officially sponsored and branded as the Dream Drive, and it draws well over 100 kids to the stadium on a given camp morning, some arriving hours before practice with hand-decorated green and gold bikes just hoping to be picked. And if one of those kids gets lucky, they may get picked to walk a player's helmet to one of the bigger events during training camp: joint practices and preseason games. At some point during training camp, the teams will start doing joint practices against each other. This means one team travels to practice directly against another team's roster for a day or two ahead of an exhibition game between the two. This year, 28 of the league's 32 teams are holding at least one joint practice. Only the Broncos, Chiefs, Lions, and Steelers are opting out entirely. Some of the higher-profile pairings on this year's calendar are the Rams hosting the Cowboys on August 11th and the Chargers hosting Jim Harbaugh's old team, the 49ers, on August 18th. Why do coaches like joint practices so much? Well, a joint practice gives a coordinator total control over the situation. He can script out a specific one-on-one pass rush rep or test out an exotic blitz package against an unfamiliar opponent without revealing a play that a real week one opponent might be sitting at home studying on film. And on the flip side, why do some coaches not participate in them? Well, for that, the reasons seem to be less about standard, more about personal preference. Take the 4 teams I mentioned earlier that aren't doing them this year. Broncos head coach Sean Payton has said he's foregoing them only because their deep playoff run last season pushed their offseason schedule back by several weeks, meaning camp itself has to do the work that would normally already be finished by now. The Steelers have a new head coach and staff, so the thinking is that their camp already has plenty to sort out without adding any unfamiliar opponent into the mix. Lions head coach Dan Campbell used to be one of the format's biggest advocates, but in the last few years, he has said these joint practices have started to feel counterproductive, kind of like the team wasn't getting out of it what he expected. There's also a health angle. Detroit has dealt with significant injury issues in the past several seasons, and camp intensity has often taken some of the blame. So keeping everything in-house gives the Lions full control over how hard their reps are. The Chiefs are probably the least surprising. They have never held joint practices since Andy Reid was hired in 2013. So their refusal to do so this year is more just par for the course. And before we move on, one funny and a little embarrassing story that I'll share about training camp practices. Last year, 2025, I got an email inviting me to get tickets for the Bills' annual Return of the Red and Blue event, which is an evening event they hold during training camp at their stadium. And the date overlapped with the weekend I was going to be in Buffalo, so I got 2 tickets. I was super excited because it was the kickoff to the final season. It was in the old Highmark Stadium. This would be the last preseason event there, yada, yada, yada. So that night, the players come onto the field. They do a bit of a show, bringing Josh Allen out. They have him run out of the tunnel solo. There's cameras following him. People are going wild. It's fun. The energy is high. There were like 40,000 fans there. And then they just start practicing. I was so confused. It was so confusing until I went home and Googled it and realized that as smart as I am about sports, I had no idea that the Red and Blue event is a practice, not a scrimmage. Oops. Joint practices aren't the only joint outings that teams will do either. Most fans know that after a few weeks of camp, teams will begin their preseason games. And one thing to note about preseason games that I've heard fans get confused by is the games don't really signify the end of training camp. Camp doesn't stop and preseason starts with the start of these games. Instead, think of the preseason games as part of the training camp with a scoreboard attached. Before and after the games, the teams will still hold practices and the same meetings, eat the same meals, etc. Teams didn't always play 3 preseason games either. In the league's early expansion era in the 60s and 70s, teams played 6 full games. They cut it down to 4 in 1978 and then cut it down to 3 in 2021 when a 17th game was added to the regular season. It effectively builds in a bye week between the last preseason game and the week 1 opener to give teams some rest. And how the teams tackle these preseason games, pun kind of intended, has changed over the decades too. It used to be that the idea of using them as a preseason dress rehearsal was most common. Usually the third game of 4, starters would play meaningful snaps well into the second quarter to simulate a real game plan. That strategy is almost extinct now. Today, starters play maybe 10 to 15 snaps in a preseason opener, and some veterans don't suit up at all. Matthew Stafford, for example, didn't play in a single preseason game across his first 2 seasons with the Rams. And many teams strategize these games so that the final preseason game is played almost entirely by players fighting for a final roster spot. In recent years, less than a third of the snaps in a final preseason game have gone to players who go on to make the 53-man roster. It's essentially an audition reel for players who are on that bubble, but it's also a bit intentional, I think. The team that plays that last preseason game barely resembles the team that will take the field in week 1. So it's a bit of a wash for opposing players or teams to study that game in preparation for the regular season. That last preseason game also brings us to the wind down of training camp, and for some players, a stressful 48 hours that decides their entire NFL fate. For all the physicality that training camp requires, the mental part of it may be the hardest, especially for those who aren't veteran stars. And that's because once that last preseason game has been played, it's time for the coaching staff to make their decisions on who stays and who gets cut. That deadline this year is Sunday, August 30th at 6 p.m. Eastern. That's the moment every team in the league has to be down to the 53 players who will make up their regular season roster. It's a little earlier this year, just to accommodate the fact that the season itself kicks off on a Wednesday instead of the traditional Thursday night opener. And it didn't used to be one cliff, I'll say. It used to be a staircase. A few decades ago, teams cut in waves. 90 players down to 85, then down to 75, and then finally to 53. It was spread out across the preseason and usually timed to the Monday after each of those 3 exhibition games. Today, though, it's one door that closes on one specific day, which is why the cut-down day carries so much psychological weight. Here's how it goes down. Every team has a person, usually someone from the front office or personnel department, whose job is to find a specific player and deliver 5 words that have barely changed in 70 years. Coach wants to see you. Sometimes with an addition, bring your playbook. That person has a nickname across the entire league, the Turk. The name was coined by a Rams linebacker named Don Paul, who was known for saying, "The Turk always strikes at night," because cuts were deliberately made in the evening, specifically so the players who survived that round wouldn't have to watch their now former teammates pack up and leave the building. In the 1950s, players had another nickname for him entirely, Squeaky Shoes, because you could hear him coming down the dormitory hallway before he'd ever knock on a single door. One former player described it decades later, almost like a horror movie, the sound of those shoes on the floor and everyone bracing at once. Why players get cut varies, and like any business decision, it involves talent and organizational politics. It's not one person's call, though final authority on who goes usually sits with the front office. Position coaches usually send recommendations up through coordinators to the head coach, who balances the feedback with what the teams need at the bigger picture. The team's general manager and personal staff weigh in. The whole group, in fact, will hold regular meetings throughout the camp to build what's called a mock cut that gets revised week by week as performances come in. The teams also have to cross-reference their proposed 53-man roster against players other teams are expected to release, since a cut candidate on their roster may still be a player becoming available elsewhere. Longtime NFL personnel staffers describe cut-down day as the single hardest day of the year on the job. A former Chicago Bears staffer, speaking anonymously years after moving on to another team, called it flatly the worst day of the year and said the only real strategy is to be as respectful as you can because some of these players will never play organized football again in their lives, even if most of them maybe already sense it's coming before the call or the knock arrives. One current front office executive with Tampa Bay, who now has to deliver this news himself, was actually cut as an undrafted rookie back in 1994. And he says the memory of that directly changed how he delivers the news to people today. He likes to tailor the message based on who's in front of him. He'll soften it for a player he genuinely doesn't think has a realistic shot anywhere else in the league. But he'll be more direct and encouraging with a player he believes can still catch on with someone else. Some coaches have tried to make the process as humane as possible over the years, too. One former head coach described giving players a defined, narrow window of time, a single hour on a Saturday, during which the phone would ring if they were being cut. If that hour passed with no call, a player could relax and know he'd survived the round. The coach said he learned to build that window in specifically after spending an entire weekend of his own career waiting to find out his fate, so he understood firsthand how unfair that open-ended uncertainty is. And what's maybe hardest on the Turk is, remember, teams start camp overstaffed. They carry as many as 90 players. That means almost 40% of players who reported to camp will hear those 5 words. The Turk has to call or notify sometimes over 35 people. And this year, that means something like 1,200 players across the league won't have an NFL job by the end of this month. But it doesn't always end on a low note for some. Once a team makes a cut, that player doesn't become a free agent instantly. He sits on waivers for about 24 hours, and during that window, any other team in the league can claim him. Once that waiver period expires the day following the cut, a released player becomes a true free agent and can sign wherever he wants. And this is the point that all the teams begin to sign their players to practice squads. So players that were cut and still unsigned after that waiver window become fair game for practice squads. And sometimes those players end up rejoining the team that just cut them. Teams can carry 16 players on a practice squad. At least 10 of those spots have to go to rookies or second-year players, while the other 6 can be filled by veterans that have no cap on their years of experience. Pay on the practice squad scales, too. A first- or second-year player earns $13,750 a week, which works out to almost $250,000 if he sticks around for a full 18-week season. A veteran on the practice squad can earn up to $23,000 a week. Now, all this said, teams aren't building their practice squads blind in that one-day window. The evaluation of who's practice squad caliber happens continuously all throughout camp and the preseason games. Coaches and scouts are already sorting players mentally into who makes the 53, who's a practice squad candidate, and who won't stick anywhere. So a player that heard those dreaded words a few nights earlier may still have a shot at their dream. They just have to take a different path to get there. And if you don't believe me, look at Kurt Warner. In 1994, Kurt was an undrafted quarterback out of northern Iowa who showed up to Green Bay Packers training camp fighting for a roster spot behind Brett Favre, Mark Brunell, and Heisman winner Ty Detmer. He was cut and went home to Cedar Falls, Iowa to stock shelves at a local Hy-Vee grocery store, making $5.50 an hour. But he kept looking for alternate paths into the NFL. He spent 3 years throwing in the Arena Football League for the Iowa Barnstormers, did a short stint in NFL Europe, and had a canceled tryout with the Chicago Bears. He landed his first NFL roster spot with the Rams 4 years later in 1998. He was backup for the first entire season and only got his real shot because Rams quarterback Trent Green tore his ACL in a 1999 preseason game. That season, Warner led the Rams to their first Super Bowl title and earned the league MVP award and the Super Bowl MVP award. He is largely considered the NFL's greatest undrafted player. And consider this. From the day the Turk found Kurt in Green Bay to the day he retired in 2010, Brett Favre, the quarterback who beat him out, never missed a single start. Kurt has said if he'd made the Packers roster that year, he'd likely have stood on a sideline holding a clipboard for years. Getting cut was how he went from being a kid from Iowa to a Pro Football Hall of Famer. So that's a lot about NFL training camps. But here's the thing about them that I hope sticks with you today. It is 6 weeks of controlled chaos, from calorie intake and team bonding to joint practices and preseason games. Training camp may be the most informative and entertaining part of the entire season. But more than that, it's the one time during the season when hope is highest for everyone. In those few weeks, every team has a shot at the Lombardi Trophy. Last year's record doesn't matter. Surprises happen. Teams turn around. It's a fresh page, a new start, and an opportunity to rewrite whatever story was written about you before today. Now, before I go, here are the questions I'm paying attention to as training camps roll on this year, and maybe you want to as well. First, the Denver Broncos. They have a new offensive coordinator in Davis Webb, and Webb has been given control of the headset, but last year's play caller, head coach Sean Payton, remains with the team, obviously. This is an interesting spot for Webb. Calling plays as one of the best play callers lurks over his shoulder, but he's not the only OC in that position. Bo Nix's ankle is also a main story of this year's training camp, so I'll be watching that. And I'll also be watching how they play their second-string quarterbacks in light of the predicament they fell into with Nix's injury late last season. Second, the Raiders. They've dominated the offseason predictions with everyone and their dog seemingly weighing in on how and when to use Fernando Mendoza. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that Mendoza starts early in the season, provided he absolutely crushes it in practices. But I think how they play him in joint practices and preseason games will tell us a lot on their strategy for using him versus Kirk Cousins. And my own team, the Lions, we have some work to do. Dan Campbell has said he expects this to be the most competitive training camp the Lions have ever had since he's been there. A big question is our new OC, Drew Petzing, and not only if he can help the offense return to form, but if he jives with Detroit's culture and playing style better than John Morton did. And as I record this, running back Jahmyr Gibbs is doing what we talked about earlier. He's showed up for camp, but he's missed 2 straight days of practice as he continues to negotiate his contract extension. Now, I'll be very surprised if Detroit fumbles him, but I do hope they get it resolved sooner rather than later because stranger things have happened. And if you want to see what goes on in a training camp, but with a more documentary-style flair, I have to recommend you tune into HBO's Hard Knocks. They're doing something different this year than in any of their previous 25 seasons. Rather than following a team that has something to prove this season, they're following the Seattle Seahawks as they attempt to win back-to-back Super Bowls. They're following the Hawks through their last preseason game, and I think it's going to be a really fascinating look at how pressure manifests differently for a team that has something to defend rather than something to prove. So that is NFL training camp in a not-so-short nutshell. Give us a like if you enjoyed this episode, and let me know, did I get anything wrong? What else do you want to hear about? And who will be the MVP of this year's preseason? Talk to you next week. Thanks for spending time with us in the middle. If today's story caught your attention, drop a subscribe, share the episode, follow us on social media, and remember, it ain't over till it's over.